Welcome to Flashback to a Fabulous Future. We are on a journey to understand the past so that we can move forward into the future with focus and energy. Today we have Michael Bressler. I will let him introduce himself. I met him at a leadership mastermind that I attended. I'll let him go into that story a little bit more. And we got on the subject of what he termed being criminal. And I would like to take that conversation, extend it a little bit, and share some examples in history where people acted outside the norm and sometimes even illegally in order to achieve a better and more often times than not, a more just society. So Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll let you take it from here for a minute.
Thanks, Gerald. I appreciate you having me. My name is Michael Bressler. I am the Chief Business Officer and Chief Investment Officer of a AI startup called Disruptive. That's one of my main roles. But really, I'm out there really just trying to think about disruption and how to think differently. Cheryl and I met at a leadership mastermind in South Florida last year. And it was around the time where in my own life, I was thinking about how to have a dynamic shift. And we were having conversations, and I had just come up with this term, being criminal, with a fellow named Jonathan Foltz. And we were at lunch in Miami, actually, and we just started talking about, how do we help people understand that they need to challenge the status quo? And what are some examples of that? And that's where the being criminal came from.
Thank you. Yeah, and I remember, you telling a story, about your son. And I just think about examples in my children's lives when I encourage them to challenge the status quo. Sometimes I think one of the most important things before we get too deep into this conversation is if you're going to challenge the status quo, which I think people need to think through that before they just randomly go out and start doing things that might be considered criminal. And sometimes they are against the law at the time, and sometimes they're just against societal norms. There's always consequences, and I think people need to think through those consequences and be willing to accept the consequences. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into some of the historical aspect of this and some of the people who might have challenged them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cheryl. I think we both agree, and a lot of people agree out there that there are things that, are the law, but maybe should be reconsidered. Maybe there are older laws that haven't been thought through. But you're right, and I think that's really when you think about the stories we'll talk about, right? A lot of it's very thoughtful, intentional people who believed in something and understood the risks to stand up for what they believed in.
Yes, and I like the word risks. There's always risks. So, I mean, the first one, we won't get into great detail because we all know about the Boston Tea Party. We'll probably stay pretty much with American history here. We won't get too far, go too far back or into other, examples outside of our country. But our Sons of Liberty definitely knew that there was going to be consequences for throwing tea overboard. There was a lot of financial investment in that, particular product, and they did. They are. I'm sure many of us have heard, and we won't go into all these examples either, of our founding fathers were considered rebels, and
Mm-hmm.
they paid a dear price. When you go through and you look through, I've seen numerous different examples, and so I won't go because I don't want to get fact checked here too much, but our founding fathers paid a high price for what they did. Many of them lost their fortunes, many of them lost their lives, but they were willing to do it because they felt like the society that they were creating was going to be not only better for themselves, but I believe personally that they were thinking way far down the line. They were thinking for generations to come. They didn't realize the full benefit of what they fought for. And so that's kind of my passion. And I think a lot of times when we think about what we're going to talk about, being criminal a little bit here, we need to think are we doing this for future generations? Are we doing this for ourselves? Are we willing to sacrifice for our future generations and not necessarily realize the benefit ourselves right now? So what are
Yeah,
your
those are great points. It reminds me of, they have stories in the Bible about asking a man why he's planting a tree because the man's so old, right? And it's really not about him getting benefit from the tree, but it's about future generations getting from the tree. You mentioned the founding fathers. I wanted to point out one thing as well is around the fact that, the idea of challenging the status quo, thinking differently, being criminal is not a concept for a certain age group, right? And you mentioned the founding fathers, and I think one of the most interesting thing for me when you think about the founding fathers was that I grew up thinking that they were older, right? Because in today's age, we look at our leadership in our country, and they're pretty much like some of them are 70, pushing late 70s, right? Maybe a minimum 50. And when you look at the founding fathers, you had folks like Thomas Jefferson, who was 33 years old. John Hancock was 39 years old. But then you've got guys like James Monroe, who was 18, right? And and so it's interesting when you see the shift of it was folks who were like, 18 to like 45 who were the ones who were really out there and thinking. And I think that's a really interesting point as far as, you compare some of the mindset shifts that we've had, I guess, in today's generation and the recent generations of, you're never too young to believe in something and to want to change something. And I mean, the best example is the founding fathers who were so young and they were, clearly mature from a mental perspective. Now, a different time, of course, but they went ahead and created a country. So if there's anyone with ever any doubt that says, oh, they're too young to try something or to fight for something, I mean, our country was built on folks who were essentially, 18, 21, 33, 39, 45, right? So I think that's an interesting point as well.
Thank you, because that gives me an opportunity here to kind of plug a new program that I'm putting together, and it's a leadership program for youth. Because
Mhm.
I do believe, and I think this conversation is so important. Of all the podcasts I've done over the last year, I honestly believe this one is really one of the most important ones I'm doing, because I think we are at a real turning point in our country, and the young people now will be the ones to determine what direction we go. I mean, technology in and of itself is so disruptive, and it can go down a really good path or it can go down a really bad path. For some reason, I don't think there's a lot of in between there. And so I think we need to really challenge our youth to think differently, to be brave, to step outside the norm, and to another thing I'm really into is this shattering paradigms. Let's kind of blow up the picture for a minute just to see what's possible, what things we've never thought of in the past we need to start thinking about. And our kids, and this is a good thing, I'm not criticizing this, but I think for generations we've just lived in a very comfortable world. And I think people have gotten so comfortable that all this disruption that's happening in our world right now, and not just from technology, but from all kinds of cultural shifts, where do we go with this? And what do we do with all this change? And how do, instead of letting change define us, we want to define the change?
Yeah, exactly. So a quote comes to mind when you were talking about that, and I've heard, everyone from Denzel Washington to Tim Robbins, and I think it was G. Michael Hoff. I think he's the one that's quoted as saying this, but essentially that, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So I believe, I mean, based on what you were saying and my own lens of the world, is that we're at the last point in that quote, which is, weak men creating hard times. And of course, the modern would be, men and women. But I think that the hard times that we're experiencing now are going to create, like you're saying, the strong men and women leaders of the future.
Yes, and I hear a lot of, I think it's just, I don't know, I haven't lived long enough, I haven't lived hundreds of years to know exactly how things were in the past. But I think I've heard for most of my life that, this younger generation, they're just not up to the task. They're just not, we won't go into all of the different definitions of these, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, I don't know, all of them and all of the criticisms of those generations. But I'll be honest, I look at the Gen Zs and I'm like, for all the criticism there is out there of all of these different generations, and comparing them to the baby boomers, which I'm a baby boomer, I'm right on the cusp there, but I'm really impressed. I see a lot
Hmm.
of really good leadership coming out of them. And, rather than putting them down and criticizing, I mean, they're young, they have a lot of maturity that needs to happen. But I see that spark, I see that flame of let's be criminal. Let's make some changes. And I think we need to embrace that and help them mature in a way that they can take on that mantle.
No, that's a great point. I think part of that is, I think human nature, the folks who are negative are louder than the folks who are positive, right?
Yes.
Because the folks who are positive are going to be generally quiet. They're not out there yelling from the rooftops because they're just heads down focused on getting things done. And so one of the things I've seen, especially with traveling, is when you go on and you look at like a TripAdvisor or a Yelp or even Amazon, like there are a lot of negative comments, right? And it's hard to know, right, what percentage of people that didn't respond were positive, and what percentage of people who are responding are really just because they're angry about something. And I think about myself and my own behavior is, you know, when you have a great experience somewhere, right? Are we intentional about, oh my God, let me email the manager, or let me email the place and say, wow, this person was amazing. They made my day, they made my flight, right?
Mhm.
Do we? I try. I really try, and I try to be really thoughtful about that. And the reason why is because on the flip side, man, if somebody does something that's, messes it up or messes something up, I'm of course very understanding, but I do like to provide feedback. And I'm not trying to be, I don't try to be obnoxious or horrible. I just try to, give some thoughts around how something could be improved. It's not a personal thing on the person, but it's just something that I see because, a lot of us are sitting there and when you're thinking differently, you're looking at a situation, you're thinking about, oh, how could that have been better? Right. And I think that's the kind of feedback you want to give, especially even if it's negative. But I think that's one of the challenges we have with generations today, not the generations themselves, but just how we view the generations, is that I work with a lot of people who are amazing and they all are in that age group, right? We've talked about our own children and they're in that age group, and my children's friends are in that age group. And I look at them and I go, I don't see any. And again, I'm probably biased for my own children, but I'm not biased for my children's friends. So,
Yeah.
I see them and I go, wow, like society, like really the world has a good future because look at these kids who are coming up. I mean, they're entrepreneurial, they're hardworking, they're hustling, they're grinding. And then you look at the kind of the more global media, and you're getting a little bit of a different lens from them. But at the same time, when we think about these topics of being criminal and thinking differently, the media has a real good knack for trying to show the world that anything new is scary and wrong, right? So I don't know how much I always believe everything the media says. I mean, the media said that the internet was a fad. Uh, the media, we can go on forever about what media or captains of industry have said. And I think that's one of the critical parts about the thinking differently and the understanding of our founding fathers, the understanding of folks like, MLK, Rosa Parks, like you mentioned earlier, Cheryl, we were talking before this, is that, there's a world out there, and the world out there that we live in today was created by people like us, right? And there's no reason why we can't be those instruments of change.
Exactly. And another name, and I don't, I don't think either one of us wants to get into whether some of these situations were right or wrong. I think at the time, a lot of them were considered wrong, but even Rosa Parks, at the time, there were a lot of people who felt what she did was wrong. But over time, we have seen the benefits that have come from it. And I was thinking about even Edward Snowden, and look how young he was when he did what he did. And I think people really underestimate the severity of the consequence he had. I mean, he lives in Russia now. Um, and get
Hmm.
and he's wanted to maintain dual citizenship, and that's been a real challenge for him because he didn't want to give up his American citizenship. He just didn't. And I don't think people realize how severe of a consequence that is to give up your, and no matter what homeland you have, but to give up your history, your home, for a choice that he made because he felt like, you know, something was wrong and he wanted to make change. And that took a tremendous amount of courage. Whether you agree or disagree
Yep.
is not
Yep.
really the point. Time will tell whether or not, the decision he made was worthwhile. And I think we need to really, when people make these choices, and even, simple things like Rosa Parks, I think about, mostly if I'm going to ride a bus, it was when I was young and in school, and how hard it can be sometimes to stand up to the norms. I grew up in Alaska, and I remember getting on the bus one day, and there was a young girl who, and I was in fifth grade. She didn't smell real, I don't know how to say it. She just didn't smell good. Her clothes were really tattered. She didn't have a coat on. And you can imagine in Alaska that was, woo, in the wintertime, you don't run around without a coat on. And nobody wanted to sit by her. Nobody wanted anything to do with her. And even though it wasn't, it's just mostly, I guess, violating societal norms, I just went and sat by her. And I went home and told my mom. My mom owned a fabric store, and she made parkas out of fur, all that kind of thing when I was growing up. And so my mom made her a nice warm coat to have. And she became one of my best friends. And to this day, in my cedar chest, I have a little music box. I mean, a very simple, wasn't even a non-function, it was a non-functioning music box that she gave me because that's all she could afford. She
Hmm.
And she was just like, you were the only person that was nice to me. Everybody else just was like, ooh, kind of get away. And I'm not saying that because I think I'm some wonderful person, but my heart just went out to her. And I think in the world that we live in today too, we need to, another part of aspect of this is our heart needs to be in the right place and to be able to look past what we're seeing and hopefully finding, the good in a world that where the news focuses
Hmm.
exclusively on the bad. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I talk to a lot of people and they tell me, I mean, I myself, I don't watch the news anymore. I
Yeah,
don't look at, I mean, even online, I just like everything you see is just negative. And it's hard to even just live in a world where it just feels like everywhere you look, something is always wrong. And but when you're out in the world though, right, you don't actually see that same thing. Like you don't see all those things happening. So I think it's challenging. And I think that's also where like social media is a challenge as well, right? Is there are a lot of these portals that we have into these segments or subcultures that, are not necessarily impartial, right? They are what someone wants to promote or present at the time. We always have these conversations. It's like, you see like, the best pictures on Facebook, right?
Mhm.
And it's like people are always like, oh my God, oh, your family looks like you had a great time. It's like, yeah, well, for those 10 seconds where we were all smiling, oh yeah, we had a great time. But for the previous 2 hours, we were just like angry at each other, because we were tired, you know what I mean? And like, so, the world is just, it's not a perfect place. And I think that's part of the interesting thing around just being more intentional and vulnerable and just being more real in who you are is, I think, like you said, right? I mean, as long as if you're doing things with the right intention and you understand the risk of what you're doing and you really believe in something, I think that we have to give credit to people who have that and have the courage, right, to stand up and do stuff, no matter if we think it's wrong or right. Now, yeah, we won't get into that too deep because like I can say that, but there are some things out in the world that like it's hard for me to even just say, wow, that's great. They have courage because like, if you're just very against a certain thing, or not against, but you support the other side more, I should say, because it's really about supporting, it's not about against, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
I think that's a good nuance to even think about is I think we can look and have empathy for everybody out there, but we can always support the thoughts that we have and support the groups that align with the thoughts that we have.
Yeah, and in the world that we live in today, there seems to be so much of this black and white thinking, and it's either right or it's wrong, and there's no, you know, no nuanced in between. And I've tried, I'm certainly not good at it, to not, well, to see both sides of an issue. I remember it, I don't know why it made me think of this, but like when fact checkers first came out, it was like when somebody would say something, everybody would race to the fact checkers to see who was, what was right and what was wrong. And then come to find out, a lot of these fact checkers are really biased, right? And I
Hmm.
came across a news service, yeah, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, that is like, okay, I'm going to take this article, and then on the side it's going to say how much of it is, biased, how much of it is leans right, leans left, whatever you want to call it, kind of thing. And I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And it's like, if you're going to read this article, you need to read this article so that you can get different perspectives. And as I went through it, I kind of like this, because instead of just being presented with one side of propaganda, I'm starting to see more, different sides. And so if I'm going to, you know, watch the news, at least maybe I'm starting to get a more nuanced version of it. And like I said, I think so much of this, thinking criminal or, defying societal norms really comes down to, in the moment. I'm sure when Susan B. Anthony went and illegally voted, that there were a lot of ruffled feathers and a lot of, like you said, we see the end result. And I always tell people, especially if you read the Bible or if you read anything, but
Hmm.
the Bible jumps out as the most profound. You're getting not just the Reader's Digest condensed version, you're getting the Reader's Digest condensed version. You're covering thousands of years in 5 verses sometimes.
Right. Yep.
You can't begin to see the whole picture. And so when these people, we look back and through history and we celebrate, and rightfully so, many of these people who have changed the dynamic of the future by the decisions that they made, and they paid a high price for it. But rarely do we really get into that high price.
Hmm.
We want to see the end result and celebrate it and move on. Whereas I think it's helpful to see all of that process, all of the mucky in between. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the challenge is that people don't care to talk about you until you're a winner,
That's true. That's very true.
right? So I like, you look at these folks and then if you really dig into whether it's a sports topic like a Messi or a Jordan or a business thing like Musk, right? When you really dig into these things, you're like, oh my God, Musk like slept on the floor of the warehouse while he was trying to manufacture cars, right? Like that's crazy. Or, I mean, even when my kids were when they were younger and they were just coming into sports, right? And I remember my son's soccer coach, they were doing dribbling exercises, and he said, "So listen, guys, like who wants to be a professional soccer player, right?" So all the kids, they're like 6 years old, raise their hands, and he goes, "Okay, Messi, Ronaldo." How many times do you think how many dribbles do you think they did a day? And these kids were like, I don't know, 100, 200, right? It's like, no, 1,000,
Mhm.
1,000 a night, right? And you think about like Jordan and all these, I mean, you call it lore because I mean, I don't know, right? But they, there's a lot of stories about, how Kobe Bryant, his first workout was at 4 in the morning, right? And his teammates would come down to breakfast and they would see him at breakfast and realize that he had already worked out and they were just starting. Or I had seen an interview also of Kobe Bryant, and this is interesting because of the high school, work ethic, which was, he went to the gym every morning at like 6 before school started as a high school kid, right? And he identified things he had to work on. He identified his weaknesses and what were the strengths he had to increase on to overcome those weaknesses. And he said sometimes the janitor would be there throwing him balls, and then he'd go to class. He would do his homework, and then after his homework, after school, he'd go back to the gym, right? Then go do something. Like, so when you think about it, like no one talks about that world, like the sacrifices, right? And he talks about, I mean, when he was alive, he talked a lot about, he never went out to parties, right? He never partied after games in high school. He didn't have a social life, right? That was the sacrifice that he made. The one thing he said that was actually really interesting to me was he would go out. So when he was asked to go out with his teammates, he'd say, "That's fine, but you got to get up for practice in the morning with me." So, so he'd go out to like the parties or the club, right, with his teammates, and then he'd be out their door at 4 in the morning. And then they would understand the work ethic because they'd say, like, how are you even awake? How are you even functioning, right? But yeah, it's an interesting thing when you look because you have all these entrepreneurs out there and you have folks out there who want to start something, but they also think it's just too hard, right? And they look at all these folks on social or just the folks who have done it and they built these huge businesses. They've really impacted the world in a positive way. Um, and you look at them and it's just like, wow, I just, it didn't, I thought it'd become easier. And it's just like, you have to look at their stories to understand, right? The sacrifices they made, the time they sacrificed, the money they sacrificed, and all that risk that they had to have in order to see the reward that they have. And then even beyond that, I mean, going through the stories of the failures, right? Like we don't even really talk about that, right? Showcasing all these folks had tremendous failure in their lives, and a lot of them had hardship, right? It wasn't simple. And so we have to remember those things.
Well, and I think we live in a world of memes where there's all these nice fancy quotes about failure and all this kind of stuff. But I've lived through I would say a significant a significant amount of failure in my life. I was blessed. I was blessed to be born into a really wonderful family, and all of my brothers and sisters and everybody were, and my parents, they were all very successful at the things they did. And for some reason, I just didn't get that natural gift of being a superstar athlete. I was a good athlete. I wasn't a superstar musician. I was, I played the piano. I did a decent job, but I wasn't like this, standout at anything. And my brothers and sisters were. And so I grew up thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not that, that good. And I didn't have a lot of, I had a lot of confidence. And this was the interesting part. I had a tremendous amount of confidence, but yet I didn't have a tremendous amount of success to go with that confidence. So it really made me sit back and go, okay, because I would go into job interviews and things like that. And I was pretty successful, especially when I was younger, at getting jobs. And I always felt confident about things. And I thought it's because I have had so much failure and I have learned how to overcome. And that's where my
Hmm.
confidence came from. It didn't come from being successful, it
Yep.
came from those challenges in my life. And it's really benefited me, throughout my life and helped me. Um, but then as life got even more and more difficult, and I wasn't overcoming those challenges as successfully as I was when I was younger, I really started to lose a lot of that confidence and my ability to, just kind of take on the world attitude that I had. And so I've had to kind of reevaluate and go back and go, oh, wow, what's going on here? How can I deal with this? How can I get through these and not come away gun shy about trying and taking risks and things? And I do think that's all part of this process that we're talking about. Like I said, we talk about all these people, these great people who've done wonderful things, but it's so hard unless you've experienced a certain amount of, failure or
Mhm.
times in your life to really appreciate. And one of the things I did when I was younger was I read a lot of stories. I mean, like really detailed stories of, like, some of the people you're talking about and others. And I could have empathy. I could feel, I was like, okay, they survived all of this, so I can survive all of this. And I think that's part of this whole being criminal, changing societal norms,
Hmm.
really getting into the stories of other people
Yeah.
on a deep
Yeah.
level.
Yeah. I love that. I love that.
Let's go back to an example in history. The Pilgrims, as they came across the Atlantic, they came under very harrowing circumstances. It was a very difficult journey. They were blown off course. They came late in the season. By the time they finally got here, they were pretty much, I wouldn't say starving, but they were definitely undernourished. And it was late in the season, far too late in the season to plant. And so as they got here to America, they found a store of corn that the Native Americans um, had buried. And yes, it was definitely criminal. They stole the Native Americans' food. They did. And there's been a lot of controversy about that, what they chose to do. Now, I guess I would have to ask myself, would I have done things any differently? Were there other
Hmm.
alternatives? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. Um, I think the challenge, and I think the first thing around the sense of empathy and thinking differently is trying to put yourselves in the shoes of the people, right, who are in the situation. Um, I think that looking at history, I don't know if there's pieces of history that we're missing, meaning were there conversations or were there things that actually happened that led to that result?
Yeah, there definitely, from all of my research, this was pretty much what happened.
Right.
And it did cause a rift. It was the initial rift between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims.
Mm-hmm.
And here's these Pilgrims who are claiming to be very religious people and, adhere to the Ten Commandments and that type of thing. But they were starving, and they would have starved and they would have died. And so they made a choice. They didn't feel like they had, another alternative. But the interesting part of this is, to me, is the far more interesting part of the story, is that even though the Native Americans confronted them about this situation, they agreed that not only would they pay back the Native Americans, because this wasn't the only store of food that the Native Americans had. They had quite a few stores, and because it wasn't at all uncommon for other Native American tribes to steal food from each other. That wasn't unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
And so they certainly wouldn't have put all their eggs in one basket. And so even though this may have put a dent in, the Native American situation, it certainly wasn't life-threatening to them. And so this is kind of what forged the relationship, was because the Pilgrims were repentant, for lack of a better word, and agreed not only to pay them back for what they had taken, but to improve upon the situation and give them more.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, the interesting part of the story is not so much that the Pilgrims took the corn, but that a situation that was technically criminal turned out to be a great starting point for a friendship between the two groups. And so sometimes, doing things, and I kind of want to go back to that idea that I don't think we just impulsively act criminal. I think there
Right.
needs to be a well thought through methodology that people go through when making these types of decisions. So your thoughts?
Well, I think the interesting thing you said was how that occurrence you believe is what led to the building of a relationship.
Mhm.
And one of the things I've always believed is that it's not about the problem or the mistake, but it's about how you work to resolve them and what your response is to them, right? Because we'll always make mistakes. Um, whether or not whether or not we're being intentional about it or not, like we don't always do the thing that we should do or do the thing that should have been done. But it's how you react to those situations that I think separate a good experience from a poor experience, right? And that's applicable, I think, in this situation, but also applicable in just the general business sense, right? A lot of times the reactions of people as far as, let's say customer service inquiries isn't necessarily about the fact that a mistake happened, but it's more the fact that the response many times has not enough empathy, or the customers don't feel heard.
Yes, I agree. And I think, from a business perspective, I totally agree. There have been many times where, and I'm sure you've experienced this also, where you may have done something that, or had an experience, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, and
Hmm.
it wasn't necessarily a good experience. But through your communications and the other party's response, it ended up being a good situation in the end because they listened, they felt like they were heard, and there came a resolution.
Right. Yep.
And I was also thinking, I was trying to think of, like more practical examples. And I was thinking of a situation in my local area here where a teacher at a high school insisted that some students, and it was a civics class. Let me preface that. I want to make sure that's clear. And she wanted to teach them about, participation in various civic type activities, one being a protest. And so she insisted that all these students attend this protest. And some of the students didn't believe in the cause of the protest. And so they didn't feel like they should be forced to protest. And so, what do you do? What do you do in that type of situation?
Hmm. Well, I think it's important to do what you feel is right.
Yes. And I, oh, go ahead. Sorry. I know.
No, no, go ahead, go ahead. I think it was just a very short answer, but yeah, I guess what were you gonna say?
Well, my thought, and is number one, you as an individual can say, I don't want to participate, and I'll just take the grade, that you're going to give me, whether that, be an F or whatever. And, if you're a really good student, an honor student, who that F is really going to impact your ability to get into a college of your choice or whatever, that can be a really tough decision to make.
No, that's true.
Yeah, you can also in enlist other people who may feel the same way that you do, and maybe take your case to the teacher and say, hey, well, I'm protesting your protest.
Yeah.
And
I
isn't that
think
part of civic engagement? Do you know what I mean?
I think it is. I think it is. Well, so let me expand on my answer. I think you do what's right, but I think you have to, this is where the thinking differently comes in,
Mhm.
right? Is like, what is another way to achieve what you want, but at the same time minimize the risk? And secondary, what's the bigger picture, right? Because in the specific example you gave, right, that's like, they always say that, it's not just a battle, it's you have to win the war.
Mhm.
And that situation is really just a battle, but there's a much bigger war that has to go on.
Yes, and sometimes looking at the bigger picture and deciding, I also study a lot about, various wars. I'm fascinated, I guess, too, with wars. And sometimes I've noticed that there are times where I wouldn't say somebody intentionally loses a battle, but they may forego, putting forth all of their effort and say, okay, I'm gonna, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, when in the Revolutionary War, when George Washington's army and they were in New York and they were fighting and they were losing. They were losing. And he could have, had another surge and obliterated his army, but he chose to retreat. He chose to,
Hmm.
fight another day. And so those, and of course, that's crossed the Delaware, and we all know that story. And so I was also thinking of another situation, and I am a tour guide for the Albemarle Historical Society here locally, and I do a cemetery tour. And this cemetery is filled with, I'm in Virginia, so it's going to have a lot of Confederate soldiers. And there's also um, a grave with a very large marker provided by his own family of a district attorney. And the story behind it is, and there's also what they call a court square tour, and there's a memorial over there. There was a Black gentleman who was accused of raping a young lady. He owned the gentleman owned an ice cream, modern day, food truck kind of thing, and he was that's what he was accused of. And several people came and without a trial or anything chose to believe that this Black gentleman had done this, and they hung him. And I won't go into all the gruesome details, but they dismembered him, auctioned off his body parts. And in the cemetery is buried this district attorney who refused to prosecute any of the people who did this to this Black gentleman. And this was, clearly back in the 1800s, when this type of thing was unfortunately allowed to happen. And
Hmm.
I always have to tell that story at the court square, and I also tell it at the cemetery. And somebody had gone into the cemetery and in red paint had spray painted racist on his very large marker. And then of course the city came in and cleaned it all off, right? But you can
Hmm.
tell that it's there. And so when I go through and I tell this story, and I oftentimes will ask people, do you think it was okay for somebody to come and spray paint racist on his marker? And they're like, oh yeah, because what he did was a terrible thing and he should have racist written all over his marker and blah blah blah. And I said, yeah, that's one solution. I said, but there is a different solution. And maybe I'm biased because I go every time I go through, I tell this story. And every time I do the court square tour, I tell this story where his marker is, where this happened. And as I tell this story, I feel like I'm changing hearts and minds.
Hmm.
And I don't know. What are your thoughts? Which do you think is a more appropriate solution, or maybe you have a different idea? I don't know.
Well, I think when you talk about the concept of be criminal or thinking different, it's really about courage, right? And based on, the story you mentioned, I mean, spray painting something somewhere uh, where we know that humans will believe it, I don't think that's courageous. So I think that there are ways to be able to share your feelings in productive ways. My point is that if you want real change, right, you need to go through a certain process to be able to invoke that change. But if you don't want real change, a lot of times I think the latter, which is, the spray painting racist, to me, that's weak because, if you really cared to be able to educate or to change the minds of people, right, in a meaningful way where there's actually backing to it. I'm not saying there isn't backing. I'm just saying, in every case, that's not the only case in the world, right? I mean, there are a million cases where, you know, somebody is, a kid raises their hand and says this person molested them, and suddenly that person's guilty, right? There's so many stories, and the media doesn't very help a lot, where people, our country was built on the concept that you're innocent until proven guilty, but with social media and with just accusations, everyone jumps to conclusions, and it's almost like you're guilty until proven innocent. So if you really believe that the person is innocent or the person's guilty, right, there's a process. And if you don't believe in the process because, maybe you believe our judicial system is not, the way to go, I think there are other processes like what you're doing, which is to educate people and help them think about things, right? Because the reality is what we need to do to help people think differently, to be courageous, to be criminal, is to help them think for themselves, to understand and capture all the facts, understand what actually facts are, and then to be able to make a decision based on their own logic. When you deem somebody something or you label something something, you're essentially, and humans love to jump on this, is you essentially are predetermining someone's opinion. And that's, I think, what gets us in trouble, right? I don't understand half the stuff that goes on in the world. I probably don't understand 80% of the stuff that goes on in the world. You know what I mean? Like, I think I do, and then I say something, and then someone says something to me, and they have a point, and I'm like, wow, what I just said was pretty ignorant, right? Why? Because I had bias. Why? Because I read something from someone or I heard a story from someone, right? Um, so it doesn't really answer your question, but I would say that what you're doing, the example that you said, which is, you talking through the history and trying to share the facts to really help people think about things. I think that's the road we need to go down, which is to help people come to their own opinions. Now maybe there are only two opinions and that's how the world works. Maybe it is very polarized like that. But I would just say that when you decide to predetermine, someone's guilt or innocence, or you predetermine what is right, what is wrong based on your own upbringing and your own bias, like that's not going to help us get to any type of solution.
And I think you've hit the nail right on the head here. I think this is a good, you've summed things up perfectly there.
Well, thank you.
I think when we engage in behavior that may go against societal norms, when we may do something that might actually be criminal, or when we choose to behave in a way that we're just kind of going along with the crowd because that's the easiest route to go. I think we need to step back and think about, do I want to be an agent of change? And if I do, is my response to this going to truly bring about that kind of change? Now, there's no way that the one time I go through and tell a story in a cemetery is going to change anything. But over the course of time, if that story keeps getting told over and over and over again, then then things can start to change. Hearts and minds can change. And I do believe, I do believe there's different levels of going against societal norms.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there are times where you do need to be criminal. I do believe that. But I do believe, in my opinion, it's when we've exhausted all other avenues
Sure. Yep.
and we're willing to deal with the consequences of our choices. And we're not like, oh, okay, I did this, but because I was right and I made this statement, I should be absolved of any types of consequences. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that should be the case. I think you need to be willing to deal with the consequences of your choices if you're going to make that kind of a statement. Um, but I do think, and I think this is a good, I don't know if you want to call it an ending point here, because I think this conversation could go on for a long time, that don't just react. Think through the process. Be creative. Try to find other solutions. Exhaust all different avenues. Sometimes you need to retreat, even if it means losing the battle, so that you can fight another day. I think all these things are processes that we should go through in order to come to some type of solution that we want to implement at the time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So you have any final thoughts? You're much better at summarizing it all than I am here.
No, I think that final summary was it. I think what you said also just kind of put the final nail in, right? I mean, what we're doing here today is just trying to help people understand how to get to the next level, whatever that level means, right? If it means from a career perspective, from a family perspective, if it means from a political or social perspective, but it's really about thinking differently, understanding that sometimes you have to be criminal in a positive way, which comes along with it risks, and you have to think about those risks, right? That's a big disclaimer in this case, right? Don't go out and do anything crazy. Um, think about the risks and understand, the folks in the history that have taken very similar risks and what the outcomes were for them. And, but at the same time, how we today benefited from those risks, right? And was that risk worth it for them? I would say it was worth it for them. Is it worth it for each of us to do those things to see future generations benefit? I don't know. I mean, those are very, very special people. If you go through all the people in history that have changed the world, whether it's through technology or voting or social liberties. They're all amazing people that have taken risks and sacrificed tremendously. But ultimately, I would say the final thought is, we all have to empower ourselves and be accountable for our own thoughts, right? And we need to be really thoughtful about what we hear and what we reshare and what we say, because what we say is reflective of our own brand and our own selves. And so we have to, and I think that's part of the challenge with the world today and a lot of the educational system today is that, we're teaching in some senses how to think. We're not teaching to be able to think. And we've become accustomed to listening to a news station, and that news station, let's say it's liberal. So like, I listen to it because I'm liberal, and then, you might have someone else, I listen to it because I'm conservative, right? You don't want to listen to the other side. And you're like, that side's not real. That side's not real, right? It's like that's, I think, part of the challenge is, what is real, what's not real, how do we get to the truth? And then instead of just blindly resharing opinion because you heard it from somebody, even if you trust that person, to be able to think for yourselves. And I think that's the most important thing. And I'll just give you one last thought, which is as a parent, it's probably one of the hardest things for me, frankly, is when your child comes home, and now mine is 18. But over the last, I don't know, 10 years, he'd come home and he'd ask me questions and he'd say stuff and he would challenge my own thinking. And then he would say things that I'd be like, who taught you that? Like, he's like, well, this is what I read, this is what I came up with. And I didn't like the fact that he had a different opinion, right? Because I was like, I'm raising these kids. But at the same time, I was proud that he took what I would say, he took what his mother would say, he took what his school would say, he took what he was reading, and he would really try to dig down into the truth. And it took me a little bit of time to appreciate it, but I'm at the point now where I love to hear him tell me things from his perspective, because I know what he's saying, he's really thought about, right? And it's not just regurgitated from a news station.
Yes, and I totally agree. I think that is just such a perfect note to end on. Um, we can learn from our kids, and kind of goes back to the whole Gen Z thing. I do think our kids, we need to give them more credit than they sometimes are given in the world as
Hmm.
we live. Um, we can learn from anyone and everyone. We just need to be a little more open-minded and think critically about things rather than just reflexively taking information that is given to us, and have the courage when necessary
Hmm.
to stand up for what we believe.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a very busy
Of
person.
course.
I really
Well,
appreciate
thank you.
it.
It was a pleasure, and I look forward to many more conversations.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Thank you, Cheryl.
Bye-bye.